Hello students, welcome to Digital Learning. I am Shubha Hiremat, Assistant Professor of English, Government First Grade College and PG Center, Dharwad. In this session, let us understand the life and works of Joh Keats, who belonged to second generation of romantic poetry in English literature. Who don't know of Joh Keats? He is the well-known romantic poet who devoted his short life to the perfection of poetry, marked by vivid imagery, great sensuous appeal, and an attempt to express a philosophy through classical legend. He is truly worshipper of beauty. In his poems, we find where he says, "A thing of beauty is joy forever." Joh Keats was son of a livery stable manager. Joh Keats received relatively little formal education. His father died in 1804 and his mother remarried after immediately. Through his life, Keats had close emotional ties to his sister Fanny and his two brothers George and Tom. After the breakup of their mother's second marriage, Keats' children lived with their widowed grandmother at Edmonton, Middlesex. John attended a school at Enfield, 2 miles away, that was run by John Clarke, whose son Charles Clarke did much to encourage Keats' literary aspirations. At school itself, Keats was noted as a pugnacious lad and was decidedly not literary, but in 1809 he began to read voraciously. After the death of Keats' children's mother in 1810, their grandmother put the children's affair into the hands of a guardian, Richard Abbey. It is on Abbey's instigation that Joh Keats was apprenticed to a surgeon at Edmonton in 1811. He broke off his apprenticeship in 1814 and went to live in London, where he worked as a dresser or junior house surgeon at Guy's and St. Thomas Hospital. His literary interest had crystallized by this time, and after 1817 he devoted entirely to poetry. From then until his early death, the story of his life is largely the story of the poetry he wrote. Early works of Joh Keats. It is Charles Clarke who had introduced the young Keats to the poetry of Edmund Spenser and the Elizabethans, and these were his earliest models. His first mature poem is the sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, which he published in 1816 and was inspired by his excited reading of John Chapman's classic 17th century translation of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Clarke also introduced Keats to the journalist and contemporary poet Leigh Hunt, and Keats made friends in Hunt's circle with the young poet John Reynolds and with the painter Benjamin Haydon. Keats' first book, Poems, was published in 1817 and was written largely under Huntian influence. This is evident in the relaxed and rambling sentiments evinced and in Keats' use of loose form of heroic couplet and light rhymes. The most interesting poem in this volume is Sleep and Poetry, the middle section of which contains a perspective view of Keats' own poetical progress. He sees himself at present plunged in the delighted contemplation of sensuous natural beauty, but realizes that he must leave this for an understanding of the agony and strife of human hearts. Obviously, we find the influence of Edmund Spenser in his poem. Next important work is Endymion, a long poem written in 1818. This poem narrates a version of Greek legend of the goddess Diana's love for Endymion, a martyr shepherd. The first line of this poem is, "A thing of beauty is joy forever." On his return to London, he moved into lodgings in Hampstead with his brothers Endymion appeared, and this work is divided into 4,000 lines section, and its verse is composed in loose rhymed couplets. The poem narrates a version of Greek legend of the love of the moon goddess for Endymion, but Keats puts the emphasis on Endymion's love for the goddess rather than on hers for him. Keats transformed the tale to express the widespread romantic theme of the attempt to find in actuality an ideal love that had been glimpsed herefore only in imaginative longings. The theme is realized through fantastic and discursive adventures and through sensuous and luxuriant description. In the summer of 1818, Keats went on a walking tour in the Lake District and Scotland with his friend Charles Browne, and his exposure and overexertions on that trip brought on the first symptoms of the tuberculosis of which he was to die. On his return to London, a brutal criticism of his early poems appeared in Blackwood's magazine, followed by a familiar attack on Endymion in the Quarterly Review. Contrary to later assertions, Keats met these reviews with a calm assertion of his own talents, and he went on steadily writing poetry. About the same time, he met Fanny Brown, a near neighbor in Hampstead, with whom he soon fell hopelessly and tragically in love. The relation with Fanny had a decisive effect on Keats' development. She seems to have been an unexceptional young woman of firm and generous character and kindly disposed towards Keats. But he expected more, perhaps more than anyone could give, as is evident from his overwrought letters. Both his uncertain material situation and his failing health in any case made it impossible for their relationship to run a normal course. After Tom's death, Keats moved into Wentworth Place with Browne, and in April 1819, Browne and her mother became his next door neighbors. In 1819, Keats had written Isabella, an adaptation of the story of the Pot of Basil in Boccaccio's Decameron. It was during the year 1819 that all his greatest poetry was written. Lamia, The Eve of Saint Anne, the great odes on indolence, on a Grecian urn, to Psyche, to Nightingale, on melancholy, and to autumn, the two virgins of Hyperion. This poetry was composed under the strain of illness and his growing love for Browne, and it is an astonishing body of work marked by careful and considered development, technical, emotional, and intellectual. Isabella, which Keats himself called a weak-sided poem, contains some of the emotional weaknesses of Endymion, but the Eve of Saint Anne may be considered the perfect culmination of Keats' earlier poetic style. Written in the first flush of his meeting with Browne, it conveys an atmosphere of passion and excitement in its description of the elopement of a pair of youthful lovers. Written in Spenserian stanza, the poem presents its theme with unrivaled delicacy but displays no marked intellectual advance over Keats' earlier efforts. Keats makes use in this poem of far tighter and more disciplined couplet, a firmer tone, and more controlled description. But the most important work of Joh Keats is his odes. They are essentially lyrical meditations on some subject or quality that prompts the poet to confront the conflicting impulses of his inner being and to reflect upon his own longings and their relations to the wider world around him. All the odes were composed between March and June 1819, except To Autumn, which is from September. The internal debates in the ode center on the dichotomy of eternal, transcendent ideals and transience and change of the physical world. This subject was forced upon Keats by the painful death of his brother and his own failing health, and the odes highlight his struggle for self awareness and certainty through the liberating powers of his imagination. Most famous one is Ode to a Nightingale, a visionary happiness in communing with the nightingale, and its song is contrasted with the dead weight of human grief and sickness. It strongly brought home to Keats in recent months by his brother's death. The Song of Nightingale is seen as symbol of art that outlasts the individual's mortal life. Equally important odes are Ode on a Grecian Urn, Ode on Melancholy, and To Autumn. The ballad La Belle Dame Sans Mercy is reveal overs and destructive side of idyllic love seen in the Eve of Saint Anne. He also wrote an epic poem, Hyperion, in a fragmentary poetic style, the second being a revision of first with the addition of long prologue in a new style which makes it into a different poem. The two versions of Hyperion cover the period of Keats' most intense experience, both poetical and personal. His poem is his last attempt in the face of increasing illness and frustrated love to come to terms with conflict between absolute value and mortal decay that appears in other forms in his earlier poetry. The subject of this epic is suppression of the earlier Greek gods, the Titans, by the later Olympian gods. Hyperion, the sun god, is their one hope of further resistance, like Milton's Satan. Certainly, the theme of this poem is taken up explicitly in the new prologue to the second version. The last years of Joh Keats. There is no more to record of Keats' poetic career. It appeared in July, and Keats was evidently doomed. He had been increasingly ill throughout 1819, and by the beginning of 1820, the evidence of tuberculosis was clear. He realized that it was his death warrant, and from that time, sustained work became impossible. His friends Brown, the Hunts, and Brownie, and her mother nursed him assiduously through the year. Shelley, hearing of his condition, wrote offering him hospitality in Pisa, but Keats did not accept. When Keats was ordered south for the winter, Joseph Sevan undertook to accompany him to Rome. They sailed in September 1820, and from Naples they went to Rome, where in early December Keats had a relapse. Faithfully tended by Sevan to the last, he died in Rome. The reputation of Keats grew steadily throughout the 19th century, though at as late as the 1840s, the pre-Raphaelite painter William Hunt could refer to him as this little-known poet. His influence is found everywhere in the decorative romantic verse of Victorian age. His poetry is marked with sensuousness and worshipper of beauty. His diction is also highly connotative, and his style is characterized by imagery and contains many poetic devices such as alliteration, personification, metaphors, and consonance. All these devices work together to create rhyme and music in his poems. Thus, John Keats shared Byron and Shelley's radical politics. His best poetry is not political but is especially noted for its sensuous music and imagery, along with certain concern with material beauty and the transience of life. His poems and letters are among the finest in English and important for their discussion of his aesthetic ideas, including negative capability. Keats was always been regarded as major romantic, and his stature as a poet has grown steadily through all changes of fashion. With this, I will conclude my lecture. Thank you.